but not least, Dr. Mariano Davies, who is the president of the British Chamber of Commerce in Denmark. Mr. Davies will defend the position that Great Britain should leave the European Union. Mr. Davies, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And may I first say, as I look around this such honorable building, where I'm really looking at the birthplace of oratory and rhetoric in Europe as we know it, it is an enormous honor and an honor that I don't take lightly. I'd like to start by just reminding myself, why did I support my Prime Minister, Edward Heath, in 1972 when he brought us into the European Economic Union, the EEC. I was a student at the time, and I was passionately burning for Europe. I think the two main issues that we saw as we moved into a new era of the United Kingdom nearing its both financial and security with Europe were perhaps those two very words: finance, economics, and security. Let me take a quick time out there. As we are debating in this prestigious house today, today's actually been a very, very important day in the history of British-German relations. Some of you may know that today is the centenary of the Battle of Jutland. Actually, nothing to do with the Danes. It just happened to take place off the coast of Jutland, and on the coast they could hear the battle take place between the German Admiralty and the British Admiralty. It's issues like this and the whole scenario of the First and Second World War that very much is at the back of our minds, also as well as the economic issues that took us into the EEC. Today, on this very day, 100 years after this battle took place on the 31st of May 1916, the grandson of Admiral Scherer, the German admiral, and the grandson of Admiral Jellicoe, the British admiral, are in Denmark at a very big activity that the Royal Navy and the German Parliament has put together so that these two young men could shake hands. I think the reason I mention this, I think it's indicative of how we as a continent, the British Isles and the European continent, have taken great steps now to move together towards a future. I don't think that future is necessarily limited to what we are seeing now take place in Brussels. I'm going to walk you through a few simple examples, maybe not simple, but a few examples of why perhaps a large number of people in the UK today see a better United Kingdom, not moving necessarily away from Europe, but actually, potentially through a Brexit, moving closer to Europe. Let me give you some examples. One of the most spoken of areas in the UK Leave campaign are the EU tariffs and non-tariff barriers. These are very much built to protect agriculture and manufacturing. These are two very big areas, but unfortunately not necessarily the most important areas for the UK. The UK is a country which has developed its present position of being perhaps one of the most successful examples of GDP growth in Europe, besides Poland, through services and financial services. I think there is a danger that, seen again from a British point of view, that the common agricultural policy, which, by the way, represents 3%, just 3% of the EU economy, is actually 40% of the EU budget. Now, there may be very good reasons for doing this, but again, seen from the Leave campaign's point of view, one of the problems is that this 40% of the EU budget is actually going to the large businesses in the agricultural sector, and it's not helping startups, SMEs, where perhaps we see the innovation for the future. Just one example. Let me dwindle a little longer on the issue of financial services. I don't think there are many people today who would disagree with me when I say that London has become the financial capital of the world. Yes, that has a lot to do with Britain's closeness to the EU, but what we have been seeing over later years is more and more over-regulation, which, again, the Leave campaign would propose could be threatening Britain's position as the financial capital of the world. And by the way, the Remain campaign is suggesting that if Britain was to leave the EU, Britain would no longer be the financial capital of the world. Well, we in the Leave campaign just don't believe that. I think Britain would continue to support its friends in Europe, Greece being one of them, and I don't think there would actually be any changes, because it wouldn't be logical to create any great change. So that's one particularly strong issue as an example, the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy. Let me take another. Britain, the UK, is a net contributor to the EU budget. Yes, this has advantages. I've heard other speakers today, particularly, well, actually one from either side, the Remain and the Leave campaign, speak about the UK as, well, almost the naughty boy of Europe. I would maintain that Britain really has been the prefect in the class, you know, trying very hard to keep the EU, the European Economic Community that we joined, on track. If we look at the gross contribution that we made in 2014, this is an approximate amount, it was 20 billion British pounds, 20 billion pounds. It's worth remembering that perhaps one of the most difficult periods in our history as the so-called naughty boy of Europe was the Thatcher era, where after much debate, it was recognized under the Fontainebleau rebate in 1984 that Britain should receive 66% of its rebate, 66% back of its contribution as a rebate. And that has been phased out here to 2011. So clearly there has been a recognition that perhaps the ideology of what we went to in 1972 hasn't been working out. I'd like to also leave you two or three last issues, and then I'll round up. First of all, the Remain campaign would like to point out that 45% of Britain's GDP is export to the EU. The Leave campaign, and there are well-known economists behind these figures, would maintain that 12% of British GDP is accounted for as export. 12%, not 45%, as export to the EU. Yet the remaining 88% of British export to the rest of the world is strangled by the regulation or the over-regulation, seen from the Leave campaign's point of view, of the EU. So there are definitely issues here that need to be addressed. A couple of final figures worth bearing in mind as we now debate this issue. If we look over the last 5 years, let's take a well-known organization like the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund has been looking at the percentage rate of change in constant price GDP, okay? Constant price GDP. According to the IMF, over the last 5 years, the accumulative GDP level of the US has been 12%. Japan, somewhat lower, 4.9%. These are countries that we compare ourselves to. Canada, 9.3%. Australia, 14.5%. Hong Kong, 13.1%. And Singapore, 16.9%. Nevertheless, in the euro area, the same figure is 2.9. And within the European Union, it's 5.2. So there are clearly issues here that we need to consider with regard to this EU project. And may I also here, as I round up, point out that if you look at the lowest rates of unemployment in Europe, Iceland, 3.2%, Norway, 4.5%, and Switzerland, 3.7%. I needn't tell you here in Greece what your unemployment rate is. Portugal, 12.2%, and Spain, 20.5%. Maybe the UK could actually be of greater benefit to the EU if it was actually outside the EU and could realize its true potential. So, ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with the thought that the Leave campaign is not about punishing Europe, but perhaps helping Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies, for this illuminating speech. Με την ομιλία του κυρίου Davies ολοκληρώνεται η συζήτηση.